In this first part, I would like to pose a scenario that, while unrealistic, will put you in the right headspace to explore the subject. Imagine you are waiting for the bus, it's raining and miserable layout, and you just want to go home. A stranger walks up and waits next to you. You nod, maybe comment on the weather, and expect the conversation to end there. Instead, the other person turns to you and says, "My father killed himself when I was 20, and I think he did it because he was secretly gay, like I am." As I said, unrealistic, but if this really happened, your fight or flight would kick in. Maybe you'd ignore them, move away, run for the hills, or maybe just decide to call an Uber. Odds are, no matter what, you aren't engaging further. That being said, this isn't a situation we are likely to encounter. Stories like these are difficult to share and uncomfortable for the people hearing and sharing them. We keep the heavy stuff for the people who have earned it for a reason. People who we know and trust have earned that trust. If you took those exact same words, put them on a page, bound them in a book, and sold it for $20, our reaction completely changes. We don't back away, we crave more. We don't check our phones, we stay up until 2 a.m. turning pages. It's interesting how oversharing in one context becomes must read material when packaged in the context of literature or even a story time video on social media. This paradox is what I'd like to explore in this video. Why is it that the stories that are most uncomfortable to tell, the ones that risk offending family members, exposing deep shame, or revealing things we usually keep hidden, are the exact stories that turn an author from a stranger into a friend? I believe that in an autobiography, discomfort isn't a flaw, it's the mechanism of connection. When an author is willing to make things awkward, they aren't just telling a story, they're offering a piece of themselves to the audience. When we look at the history of writing itself, we see an evolution of intimacy. Texts like The Pillow Book by Sei Shanagan, even though it's 1,000 years old, it still feels personal and modern. You can feel a spark of recognition in her lists and her complaints as people today still comment on the strange behaviors of others, small things that bother them, and share funny stories. But sharing your opinions and fun snapshots of your thought process is different than sharing your trauma. There's a distinct type of autobiography that relies on what I call the uncomfortable truth. It's the kind of writing where you can almost feel the author's hands shaking as they type. It's akin to reality TV in its rawness, but it possesses a depth and a purpose that reality TV lacks. At times, you can hardly believe that the person writing those words found the strength to share those deeply intimate and personal experiences. It's not drama for the sake of attention or anything like that at all. It's true vulnerability. In my experience with autobiographies, many authors tend to gloss over the more difficult periods in their lives, mentioning them but not truly diving in. This isn't to blame them, as they may not be comfortable sharing, and it's their telling of their own story. They can do it however they want. I mention it instead to recognize how it isn't common, even in the autobiography medium, to be so open. Sharing those experiences can serve as support for readers who may feel like they are alone in experiencing something similar, or just as a reminder to some of us not to take what we have for granted. Today, I want to examine two texts: Jesmyn Ward's Men We Reaped and Alison Bechdel's Fun Home. In exploring the two texts, I hope to understand how literary oversharing is actually a tool for radical empathy and a bond that's hard to explain. When I was reading the respective pieces, I was thinking about how brave the authors were and how difficult it must have been to share some of the things in their works. The two texts I'm examining today take authenticity to a painful extreme. These authors aren't just sharing facts, they are sharing the things that usually stay buried inside or get shared in therapy sessions, things that we may never work through and can only try to make sense of. When an author does this, they initiate a parasocial contract. They agree to be vulnerable, and in exchange, we agree not to look away. But why is it so readable? Why didn't I put Jesmyn Ward's book down when it got sad and downright depressing? That's something I genuinely wanted to know, as reading about the tragic real life events featured in the book made me profoundly sad, but that only made me want to continue reading even more. Let's start with Alison Bechdel's Fun Home. You might actually recognize her name from the famous Bechdel test. It's that simple rule for movies that asks, do two named women talk to each other about something other than a man? It's a popular term even for those unfamiliar with Bechdel herself, and it actually originated in her long-running comic strip, Dykes to Watch Out For. While the Bechdel test is about broad cultural observation, her memoir Fun Home is about the details of one specific, very complicated family, her family. And when I say details, I mean it gets into the weeds perhaps more than some family members would be comfortable with. The creation of the book was an obsessive process for her. Bechdel didn't just sketch from memory, she staged it. She took reference photos for every single panel, posing as her father, posing as her mother, and posing as her younger self to get the body language exactly right. She painstakingly recreated family letters, maps, and photographs with shocking accuracy. When I found out the creation of this book was a 7-year process and saw comparisons of the illustrations in the book and real life subject matter, I was in awe of the effort put in. This wasn't just drawing, it was reconstruction, and this meticulous style is crucial because of what she was reconstructing. The book explores the strange relationship she had with her father, a high school English teacher and funeral home director who she later discovers was gay, just like she is. In a traditional autobiography, an author might just tell you, my father was distant and controlling, but because Bechtel is using this visual medium, she doesn't just tell us, she forces us to see it. We see the way he polishes the furniture, the way he arranges the house like a museum, and the way he looks at other men. Even before she reveals to us that he's gay, there's evidence of his secret life right there in her memories. This is where that uncomfortable truth I mentioned earlier comes in. Bechtel is essentially airing out her family's dirty laundry in graphic detail for the world to see. She discusses her father's affairs with younger men, his suicide, and her own sexual awakening. It is the definition of oversharing, but because she presents it with such intellectual rigor, quoting authors like Camus and Fitzgerald, analyzing the maps of her hometown, it doesn't feel like gossip. Throughout the book, Bechtel wrestles with the uncertainty surrounding her father's death and whether or not it was a suicide. The uncertainty seems to make it hard for her to rest, since she doesn't know if he succeeded in killing himself or if it was an accident. At times in the book, we can see evidence that could support an argument for both sides, all while exploring Bechtel's relationship with her father as she grows up. It feels like we are being invited to analyze her story with her and come to a conclusion. A great example of her style is on pages 80 and 81. On these pages, she shares her sexual discovery in college and then abruptly shares the moment her mom called her and shared that she was getting a divorce from her father. On the very next panel, she shares the call that she received after her dad died. Just like how they hit her in real life, these moments come fast, out of nowhere, and catch the reader off guard. It almost feels like a plot twist, but no, they're all real experiences that complicated her life. When Bechtel invites us into her life through Fun Home, we feel like she trusts us completely with her story, and that's a trust we rarely experience, even with those closest to us. She allows herself to be vulnerable and to share stories of sexual discovery, which to me, a straight man, felt like something I shouldn't be seeing. That being said, I couldn't help but admire Bechtel's evident self-security and tell-all openness. She concludes that her father's death was a suicide, while also acknowledging that she will never know for sure. She also accepts his flaws and that he loved her in his own way, through sharing his love of art and literature. We see both shared directly in memories of their conversations Bechtel shares in Fun Home, and in references to authors and stories she makes throughout the book. While Fun Home may feel familiar to readers in the nature of how Bechtel shares her stories, Jesmyn Ward's Men We Reaped creates a unique emotional discomfort and atmosphere of sadness and frustration. To understand why this book hits so hard, you have to understand where it comes from. Ward grew up in Delisle, Mississippi, a small rural community on the Gulf Coast. It's a place of intense beauty, but also deep systemic poverty and racism. This is the landscape that shaped her and those featured in her memoir. Before she wrote Men We Reaped, she wrote fictional novels like Salvage the Bones, featuring characters that struggled to survive in a similar setting. You can't help but imagine she was drawing on real knowledge and experiences to write her fiction. In Men We Reaped, she reveals that heartbreaking truth that her fictional characters were reflections of real men she was losing in her life. Men We Reaped's premise is brutally sad, but it is a true story. She writes about the deaths of 5 young men she grew up with, including her own brother, who all died within a 5-year span. Ward writes about it through a brilliant, albeit painful, structural choice. She walks through her family life and personal life, growing up in chronological order. She shares about Delisle, her parents' divorce, and her childhood. Those chapters alternate with a reverse chronological revelation of the deaths. She starts with the last death and moves backward in time to the first. By doing this, she denies us the comfort of moving on. We know that there are more deaths coming, and for each one, Ward was less prepared. What makes the reading experience especially difficult is how Ward makes us familiar with each of the men who die. She tells us about how she knows them, how they were, and what they were doing in their lives before their untimely deaths. There's a specific kind of vulnerability here that is different from Bechtel's. Bechtel shares the taboo, Ward shares the unbearable. She admits the things that most people keep private out of self-preservation. She writes about her own guilt and suicidal thoughts. She writes about the time she wasn't there. She writes about the grinding pressure of being a young black man in the South, where the odds are stacked so high against you that survival feels like an accident. One of the hardest things to read, and the most intimate, is how she talks about her brother, Joshua. She doesn't paint him as a saint. She shows him as a full, complex human being who's trying to make a life in a world that seemed designed to crush him. She bridges the gap between the characters she wrote in her fiction and the brothers she lost in reality. showing us that the tragedy wasn't a plot point, it was a real daily life for some men. Ward does a great job describing the many challenges young black men face growing up in Delisle that end up filling the reader with the idea that it takes luck to make it out. They were all doing similar things: hustling, drinking, smoking, and hanging out, doing their best in the situations they were in, and got caught by something. Each man died in a different way. Ward's brother Joshua died in an accident caused by a drunk driver, Ronald by suicide. CJ died when his car was hit by a train due to broken crossing signals. Demond was murdered after testifying as a witness in a drug-related trial, and Raj had a heart attack induced by drugs. It was truly awful to read each chapter about the men, hearing about how near and dear they were to Ward, knowing that they were no longer with us. One of the most profound and impactful things I read was towards the end of the book on page 239. After I left New York, I found the adage about time healing all wounds to be false. Grief doesn't fade. Grief scabs over like my scars and pulls into new painful configurations as it knits. It hurts in new ways. We are never free from grief. I chose this quote to focus on because aside from the challenging sections of the book that cover the tragic deaths of the 5 young men she knew and loved, this quote was the most dramatically or emotionally impactful. It helped me cope with the deaths of the people who have passed away in my life. I've noticed that in my own life, I deal with death poorly. I have a hard time seeing any purpose or greater meaning in death, especially when the people who've passed are young. Ward's words consoled me as she made me feel like it wasn't strange, it was normal to feel that way. Thanks to Ward's openness, I was able to greater understand that to be true. Let's return to the bus stop example. If a stranger walked up to you in the rain and dumped their trauma on you, you'd still back away. Nothing new about that. Fond home and men we reaped help us understand why we back away. That real-life example offers no context and no structure. That is the magic trick these authors pull off. They take the exact same kind of information that would send us running in real life, and they build a way for us to experience it without being taken completely aback. Alison Bechdel builds her experience out of intellect and archives. She uses painstaking recreation of her world and literary references to draw a line to help us look at suicide without blinking. Jasmine Ward builds her experience by utilizing time. By structuring her memoir in reverse, she forces us to sit with the ghosts of these men, making us feel their life before we have to mourn their death. In the end, these books prove that oversharing is the wrong word for what happens in literature. In a world where our social media feeds are curated highlights and our small talk is obsessed with the weather, these stories are real and necessary. We don't read Bechdel or Ward to be voyeurs of their pain. We read them because they are brave enough to say the things we are too scared to say about our own families and our own grief. When they initiate that parasocial contract, they aren't asking for our attention. They're teaching us how to endure. They show us that if you can turn the most painful moments of your life into a story, you don't just survive them, you connect with people you will never even meet.